Great. Welcome to ArtNow, the Columbia College Chicago Art and Art History Department's curricularized one-credit speaker series, where students learn about and engage with a diverse mix of art makers, curators, critics, historians, and entrepreneurs, international, national, and Chicago-based, who are actively authoring the culture of our times. Lecture participants are exposed to the rich range of perspectives, practices, and professional pathways possible for the contemporary creative. I would like to offer thanks to Mimi Yu, who organizes, films, and edits our lectures, Sam Foster, my wonderful graduate teaching assistant, my wonderful colleagues Joan Giroux, Adam Brooks, and Amy Mooney, who have made this programming possible, Gina Ordaz for her help with our guests and student studio visits, and our chair, Duncan McKenzie. And right now, I'd like to share with you my PowerPoint to show you about what is coming up in the semester. So our series is live broadcast over YouTube with URLs available the week before the event. On February 17th, we had our esteemed Columbia College Chicago Art and Art History professor colleague, Amy Mooney. Of course, tonight we welcome Paul Sacaridiz. On March 17th, we have Indigenous and interdisciplinary maker Natani Nota. March 31st, we welcome Lily Kays, who's an alum of the Interdisciplinary Arts program at Columbia College Chicago. And on April 14th, we welcome Sampata Aranque, a School of the Art Institute of Chicago art historian. And now it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our wonderful colleague, Paul Sacaridiz. Paul is the executive director of the Haystack Mountain School of Crafts in Deer Isle, Maine. From 2007 to 2015, he served as professor and chair of the Department of Art at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has extensive experience in higher education, administration, and leadership in not-for-profit arts organizations. He has been named a fellow with the National Council of Arts Administrators and has most recently served on the board of the National Council on Education for the Ceramic Arts. As a sculptor, he is interested in the collision of abstraction, urban planning, and utopian systems, and the seemingly impossible task of understanding something in its entirety. Over the past number of years, he has produced multiple large-scale projects designed for specific institutions, such as the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Denver Art Museum, and the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, among others. He has been the recipient of numerous artist residencies, including the Ragdale Foundation, the Vermont Studio Center, the Watershed Center for the Ceramic Arts, and the Arts Industry Program at Kohler. As well, now in its 5th year, through a partnership between Columbia College Chicago's Office of Academic Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, under the leadership of Folaimi Wilson and the Haystack Mountain School of Crafts, we offer the Haystack Fellowship and Arts Administration Paid Intern Program for Columbia College Alana students of African descent, Latinx, Asian, Arab, and Native American, as well as LGBTQIA and international students of color to receive fellowships to one of Haystack's 2-week summer workshops. Information on the status for applications during the pandemic is forthcoming. Finally, I'd like to inform you of a recorded session on March 10th at 6 p.m. in which Paul will be leading a conversation called Learning and Leading Through Craft. We invite the esteemed colleagues Namita Gupta-Wiggers, the director of the MA in Critical Craft at Warren Wilson College, and our esteemed colleague Bob Blanford from Columbia College Chicago. In this highly personal discussion, we will look at the ways we learn and lead through craft. What are some of our earliest memories of making things, and how have those lessons impacted our lives as artists, curators, educators, and leaders? Why does craft matter, and what are the structures for learning outside of academia? Who has historically had access to these spaces, and how can organizations broaden the communities they collaborate with and learn from? What is the role of cultural leaders in creating greater equity in the field of craft, and what are some of the most pressing questions we should be addressing at this moment in time? This lecture will be recorded. And without further ado, I welcome Paul to share with us. And afterwards, we will have a Q&A. I want to thank the Columbia College Chicago students for some extremely thoughtful and meaningful questions, which I think will offer us a wonderful conversation after Paul's presentation. Welcome, Paul, so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. Am I coming in loud and clear?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. I wish that I was actually in front of all of you instead of behind a screen, but it's a pleasure and an honor to get to talk with you tonight. So I'm going to start off and share my screen. Mel, I'm going to ask you to confirm that everything can be seen correctly.
Beautiful, looks right on.
Okay, great. Well, I'll start off and say that I'm really pleased to get a chance to speak with you all. And over the past few years, I tried to make it a point to visit Columbia College annually. I generally try to come around this time each year. And I was there last year, just before everything started to shut down with the pandemic. And in fact, it was really the last trip that I took before the world really changed. And so while I'm not glad to not be there this year, I am glad to continue the tradition of talking with you. So as Mel mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Haystack Mountain School of Crafts. Haystack is a craft school that's located in Deer Isle, Maine. And it's a really remarkable institution. It was founded in 1950 as an experiment in craft and community and education. We're a school that offers no degrees or certificates. We have no permanent faculty or student body. We offer short-term workshops in a variety of craft-based disciplines. People come to the school for generally 2 weeks at a time. And we have a constantly changing group of faculty and students. And the school really reinvents itself every few weeks. We run from May through October, and this is an aerial view of our campus, which is in Deer Isle, Maine, which is right on the coast, about 10 hours north of New York City and 5 hours north of Boston. I'm going to talk tonight about the school, and I'm going to talk about my work as an artist. And kind of in the middle of those two kind of bookends, I'm going to kind of make the case for how I made a transition from being an academic and being a working artist and a studio-based artist to being in a leadership role where I run a not-for-profit. And so the talk's broken up into 3 chapters, and I'm going to take you through all of those now. So for a long time, I've made sculpture. My background is really rooted in craft. I was very fortunate growing up. I had a family that was immensely supportive of my interests in art. My father was trained as a painter. He worked as a graphic designer for really his entire professional life. I grew up in the 1970s. My mother was a weaver. There was a lot of macrame happening, and my home was a place where it felt like creative activity was very common. And so my interest in art really was fostered from a very early age. And I have to say my parents were quite remarkable in the sense that they never pushed me to think that I had to do something else. And I realize now that that's, it's an incredible privilege that I had people growing up who allowed me to kind of pursue this interest that I had with very few questions asked. And I started working in ceramics at a fairly young age. I was probably a teenager at a local arts center. And I continued on, and I went to college. I went to the Rochester Institute of Technology, which had a place called the School for American Crafts. And then I went to Alfred University, where I finished as an undergraduate student, and that was in upstate New York. And then lastly, I went to graduate school, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, just down the street, so to speak, from where you might be tonight. And so for years, I made sculpture. I have always worked within a certain language of architecture and ornamentation and urban planning. This is a piece that was based on a cityscape. These are cast porcelain units connected by this PVC tubing on this kind of trestle style table. It's roughly 10 feet long. and then a much more recent piece from just a few years ago, which was part of a large project on contemporary ceramics that was commissioned by the Denver Art Museum. And I've always been interested in architecture, and I've been interested in urban planning and utopian systems and in the way things work and how things function. And I would say that my work ultimately is kind of about presenting a system and a structure where things look incredibly intentional, where there's a certain kind of logic, both sculpturally and conceptually, but where, you know, the exact trail of that is still a bit ambiguous. I'm not interested in my work being illustrative of a specific kind of idea solely, but I've involved research pretty heavily into my life as an artist. When I lived in Chicago, which was a really influential time, I became very interested in the World's Fair of 1893, in Daniel Burnham as a city planner, in the ways in which architecture and ornamentation were used to kind of exemplify a value system and power systems, in kind of relationships that took place in urban space, and in the really complicated ways that ceramics served a role in that, as a cladding on buildings, to a material that could mimic different surfaces from granite or marble, and the way in which clay was this material that in some ways was often almost invisible. We're around it all the time, from our domestic life to architecture, but it's something that has this wonderful ability to kind of fade into the background. And so as I started, you know, continuing to make work, you know, this sense of trying to make work that was referential of systems became really my core endeavor. This piece is roughly 15 feet high to the top point. It's made of powder-coated aluminum and wood, ceramic, paper. And within this and lots of other work that I've made during this time, I was really interested in the way that materials could kind of mimic other things, as I mentioned, with the way that ceramics does that with architecture. And so some of these forms that you're seeing were modeled on a computer, they were printed out on a plotter, they were folded in cardboard and paper, they were cast in ceramic molds, they were made in porcelain, and then other things were made in that same matter but never cast and covered in tape. And so there's a kind of an interplay between what's ceramic and what's glazed and what's not, and what's paper and what becomes metal. And also objects that are made at very different speeds of time. I'm interested in the way in which sculpture can exist as an image, the way that it's very much an illusion. There's often a conversation that kind of sculpture fails as an image. And we hear this a lot, that sculpture has to be experienced physically. And I both agree with that statement and I disagree with it pretty profoundly, because I've often thought of sculpture as a very imagistic activity, in the sense that I think that as a discipline, it has the ability to be kind of a thing that nothing else can be, right? It can be that object that you can't quite name, or an experience that doesn't quite fit neatly into any other category. And in that sense, I've always quite loved the way that sculpture can exist as an image, and how it can be something that's highly specific and exists at a certain moment in time. And increasingly, my work would shift from kind of taking on specific histories of architecture and trying to illustrate certain kinds of concepts of utopian systems and failure and possibility, and begin to be kind of an exploration and a study of abstraction and materiality. And so this is another example of one of those interconnected pieces. And you know, this was an object as part of that cluster that, you know, again, originally was modeled in Rhino on computer. I made a series of interconnecting forms that could tessellate. I printed it. I made rubber molds. I cast it in wax. I assembled them. I sprayed them in plaster. I sprayed them in pigment. And the piece continues to go through these iterations until in the end, there's this object that in a way could never have been planned, and that exists through all of these layers, in the same way that the plywood that it springs from is kind of striated in that way, or in the same way that the box that it sits on as a support is striated as pressboard, or that this structure at the top, which is cardboard tubes that are covered in vinyl, or ceramic on the far left that's been made and broken and reassembled. And I've been really fortunate in my career in so many ways. And if I was in front of you, I would really kind of pause for a moment and acknowledge that. Prior to my current position, I spent almost 20 years teaching in academia. I was very lucky to receive a teaching job within a couple of years of leaving graduate school. And since that time, I've been the recipient of really extraordinary institutional support. I think that a lot of times academics fail to acknowledge that. And I think that there's often a kind of complicity in a way that we forget that the systems we teach and we work inside of are also kind of our greatest benefactors. And so I was able to make work and never had to worry about selling it in a commercial way. And I could think about things in a very expansive and ambitious manner. And I've also had great support from institutions. And so this was a project that I took on where I was invited to do a project for the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I was one of 4 people that were invited to respond to a part of the museum's collection. In this case, a display of furniture that all dated from the founding kind of time period of the city of Philadelphia, which for me was interesting in that it's considered the earliest utopian planned city in America. And so I thought about this collection of furniture that seemed to be this beautiful iconography of kind of objects made at a certain time and a certain ethos that I really loved and I thought were really kind of beautiful and also kind of wonderfully strange. And I took objects out of this collection, all of which existed behind a plate glass wall. And then I reinserted objects that I had produced that really spoke to labor and pattern and systems of making and decoration. And then these are a few works that kind of predated this that were part of a series that I call the Decorative City. These ceramic elements, the blue that you're seeing on the shape in front and on the kind of pyramidal forms, were all made at the Kohler Arts Industry Program in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I spent 3 months there in the early 2000s and got to work in what is ostensibly the largest porcelain factory in the United States. You likely are familiar with Kohler as a maker of toilets and sinks and things like this. And during the residency, you're given access to these incredible resources and facilities and incredible skilled labor that I was able to work and learn from to make a series of objects based on decorative food molds. In this case, a large kind of bundt pan that was blown up in scale and cast. And so this really thought about the shapes of the decorative shapes of kind of everyday objects and how those could be rethought as potentially part of a fantastical cityscape. And then accompanying it are these kind of absurd piles of terracotta clay that are just extruded and let fall where they do. And so one object, that orange pile, took probably 10 minutes to make, and the object in the front probably took like 80 to 100 hours to make. And I'm interested in that interplay of materials and intentionality. And then other parts of this series, and again, that had to do with things that were highly specific in how they were made, like this architectonic object that was cast in the front, which was made from a variety of found parts, all of which were slip cast, and then this extrusion of clay in the back that then was actually painstakingly sprayed with a red surface, almost like it's made of solid color. And at the time, these supports, almost like these architect-style trestle tables, were really a nod towards a certain kind of history of architecture and planning, and this idea of sculpture as a propositional object or something that was kind of in the process of becoming, which influenced the decision for many materials to be left unfinished or raw or kind of in between states. And I suppose ultimately my greatest hope with this work and with all the work that I've really made as in a kind of more mature time in my life as an artist, has been a desire to make things that hopefully are really kind of beautiful in a strange and almost kind of eluding way. And also to make things that hopefully are really kind of strangely intriguing and that have a sense of intentionality, but that what that intention is kind of forever uncertain. But hopefully that there's also a quality that if one piece were moved, it would somehow seem like it was off. And so again, this is the quality of sculpture that for me, I find just so profoundly moving as not just as an object of art, but really as like a human experience. But as much as I can describe the work I've made in those terms and talk about architecture and kind of the language of sculpture, everything for me has really stemmed from a true love of being in the studio and of making things. And if anyone is familiar with ceramics or really the process of making sculpture in general, in many ways, it's so materially based in certain practices. And for me, that's the place I've derived such tremendous joy. And there's something about being in the studio and mixing vats of liquid or mixing materials together to make clays, or the kind of haphazardness of seeing what objects look like when they're piled onto a shelf, or that moment of pause when you're making something and along the way you realize that kind of the thing that you're doing midpoint is so much more interesting than anything you're going to end up with in the end. And while this image of a table with objects that were being prepared to cast and plaster to make molds, I realized at this moment, like, I'll never make anything in the end that's as compelling as this setup. And this setup highly influenced some of those structures that you saw later. But in some ways, I could say this has more urgency and more kind of uncertainty than anything I could have ever made. And so I love these moments when the work kind of gets ahead of you, right? And then your job is to try to kind of catch up with it. And at this moment, I think it's these moments in the studio where, there's a sense like when you go into the studio, there's this idea that there's always someone sitting on your shoulder, or that there's many people on your shoulder. There's your former teachers, or there's your kind of artistic heroes, or there's your self-doubt. And that the longer you work and the more you kind of believe in that process, and the more kind of in it you become, those voices or those little people start kind of leaving. And at a certain point, you're really left with this really remarkable experience of understanding something through materials and through learning something through the things you're doing in a way that you could never have imagined before. So this was the process of separating a really complex object into multiple parts that would come apart in a mold. And again, I think this setup for me is like always the most interesting. And I've often asked, what would happen if I stopped here? Like, what would happen if this was actually the finished object? And I could say that perhaps I've really never had, the courage to say this is done. And there's this sense that we have like, well, it has to be taken to the next step, or it has to be permanent. This is too ethereal. This is only clay sprayed on paper. It wouldn't last. But what if I let that last? What if we said that the thing that was in progress was actually enough? And what if the things we make as artists don't have to last forever? And what if actually objects are the most burdensome thing we ever produce? And what if we didn't have to kind of have that weight? So there's chapter 1. So the whole time that I was involved in teaching and I was involved in making my work, I also was increasingly involved in the work of other not-for-profit organizations. And I think one of my biggest pieces of advice I would offer to you as students, whether you're undergraduates or graduate students, is to begin looking at the field that you feel the most kinship to, whether it's performance or ceramics or general sculpture or photography, whatever it may be. Look to the thing that you care about and look for the professional organizations and the networks that exist nationally that support that. And think about how you can either be involved in it, or you can participate in it, or you can learn from and alongside those groups. Because these organizations, like the ones listed here, these are the places where you'll develop really remarkable networks. And they're also the organizations that post-schooling, post-leaving an academic program, these are the organizations that are really moving fields forward. And so these are 4 of them that I've worked with very closely over time. And the last one, CERF Plus, the Artist Safety Net, I would recommend to anyone to look at, which is an organization that is dedicated to providing artists with emergency grants when they're in times of crisis and emergency. And so I currently serve on their board, and I've worked on the boards or with the boards of each of these organizations over the past 15 years. So when I was at the University of Wisconsin, which was the second teaching job I had two of these tenure track jobs, and I had tenure at both institutions. The first school I taught at was Illinois State University, which is in Bloomington Normal, Illinois. I went there directly, almost out of graduate school a year or two later, and I taught there for 8 years. I went through the ranks of applying for tenure, and I received it. And I loved teaching there. It was primarily a school that served first-generation college students, and it's the oldest state institution in Illinois. And after 8 years, I did decide to leave for a variety of reasons, and I took a position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which, as many of you know, is it's a huge school, 44,000 undergraduate students. It's part of the Big Ten network, and it's an R1 research institution, which means tremendous resources for faculty research and creative development of your ideas in every possible discipline. And as a faculty member, I was the recipient of remarkable support for my work. But I went into Madison kind of with two goals in mind. One was to teach and to run a ceramics program, which I did. But the second was to work as an administrator. And I was always interested, like in my work of systems, with how the institutions that I worked for and taught in, how did they run? You know, when you were told you have a budget, where does that come from? When you're told that there's curriculum, who sets it? When you're told that there are requirements for graduation, like what group determined that? And I was always fascinated with the intricacies of how things worked. And I was increasingly interested in things outside of just the department that I taught in. So at one point in time, I was nominated for this fellowship through a group called the National Council of Arts Administrators. And if that sounds really boring to you, you're not alone, right? Like you kind of couldn't come up with a worse title that would sound deathly boring, but it was really interesting. And it's another one of these professional groups that gets people together who teach in art departments, who work as administrators, and tries to give them skill sets to succeed. And so as a fellow in this, I had a mentor for a year who was a dean at a large school somewhere. And at the end, I gave a presentation. And the presentation was called The Artist as Administrator. And the kind of high points of that talk that I gave, which I realized was mapping out for myself what was happening to me and where my values were changing. At a certain point, I found myself traveling a lot. I was traveling for work for the university. I was in leadership roles in the department I taught in as a chair or a graduate chair. I was in charge of curriculum. I was doing lots of work to advance the mission and the role of our department and to provide opportunities for our students and faculty. I was also doing a lot of work with not-for-profits on a volunteer basis. I was making my work, and then I was involved in a project with my wife, Jennifer Lapham, when she started this project called the Midwest Clay Project. And Jennifer decided to start it wasn't a not-for-profit, it was an LLC, but it was a community-based studio in Madison, Wisconsin that would have a gallery, a residency, small residency program, internships, and community classes for people to work in ceramics. And while this wasn't my project exactly, I was the kind of silent background partner on it. And we thought a lot as a family. This is my son in the blue shirt. He's now about to graduate from high school. This is probably 10 years ago. And we thought a lot as a family about, like, what does it mean to invest in the community we live in? And I started asking the question, like, what if I put all the work and time and the knowledge and skills that I have that I usually put towards making kind of oblique sculpture, what if I put it towards building a space? And what if I took the grant funding that I had from the university to make my work and put it towards a project that would benefit other people? And so this became a tremendous part of our lives. We built out 2 spaces, we moved it twice. The studio is in different hands since we've moved to Maine, and it's celebrating its 10th anniversary. And the small child in the super cool little pants is my daughter, who's now 14. She was a terrible drywaller, right? But our entire family was a part of this undertaking. And that was a profound, profound experience to think about our role as one of building community. At the same time, I was deeply involved in working with the National Council for the Education for Ceramic Arts, which is the largest specialty organization in the visual art field. It puts on a conference of between 5,000 and 7,000 people every year somewhere in the country. I helped to organize a very large event in Milwaukee. I cited 120 exhibitions. I helped with grant writing. I helped with fundraising. And basically, I put all the parts together with a whole team of people to pull off this large conference. And at the end of the day, the conference happens, and my name was really just a small footnote on the credit for the event. Theaster Gates was the keynote speaker just kind of prior to his well-deserved meteoric rise, right, of fame and success and influence. We were able to bring Theaster in for a keynote, and I would argue that his keynote, which was on the need for Blackness in contemporary ceramics, I think that it truly was the moment that brought about a radical change in the field of ceramics to acknowledge its whiteness and also to begin to ask questions in very new ways. And so I was immensely proud to be able to take part in an event that put all these parts together. But then in the end, it wasn't really my name that was getting the credit. I simply helped make something happen that then also served as a platform for other people to thrive and to have opportunities and to advance their own work, and also most importantly to advance the dialogue and discourse of the field. And so I would kind of charge you with asking that question of yourself, what are ways that as artists you can be involved in projects that are bigger than you? What are ways that your interests and skill sets and resources and kind of positions of privilege or power can be used in ways, again, that are greater than yourself? And this isn't to say that being in your studio and making objects and engaging in a gallery system is somehow lesser than something else. But I would argue that that's only one way of existing in the world as an artist. And I think that oftentimes as students, you're not presented with very many options that are more broad sometimes than the work of, say, any given faculty member or the model of an artist who succeeds by having a kind of a star career. And so the question is, as you see in the note on the right, what does success look like? Where does a department or a group or a person want to be in a number of years? And what are your strengths or vulnerabilities and dreams? This image for me is a really poignant one because on the left is an image of my studio at the end of my time in Wisconsin after 8 years. And on the right, after 7 years, and on the right is a piece of paper I found on the floor after running a retreat for faculty in the art department. And I was constantly juggling these two kind of thoughts, being an artist, thinking about leadership, and then working kind of nationally with not-for-profits. And trying to decide, is this sustainable or is it time to make a shift? And this was the moment at which I decided I didn't want to be in academia anymore. I was having a harder time justifying the kind of structure of the system I was working in, and I wanted very much to lead a not-for-profit. And so I left an academic teaching job as a full professor. I had tenure, I had remarkable access to resources, and my life in some ways as an academic was at the moment where everything was about to get much simpler, and I would have had a really great career in life. But somehow I felt that it was time to leave. And so I resigned from my job after, I should add, applying for and receiving the current position I have, which is the executive director of Haystack. And so this brings us to chapter 3. So this is a cover of the Haystack catalog. This was from 2020, and again, this was the beginning of the end in some ways, or the beginning of the future, however we kind of decide to look at it. This was the catalog that we sent out and that we then pulled back and when we canceled programming because of COVID. So Haystack, as I said, is located on the coast of Maine. The school was founded in 1950. And in addition to being an influential craft school and one of a very small number of institutions like ours in the country, perhaps maybe 10 nationally, and maybe I would say 6 that are really in the kind of category that we are, Haystack also is a really important place architecturally. It was designed by an American architect named Edward Larrabee Barnes, a kind of a mid-century iconic architect. And Haystack is considered one of his most outstanding projects. And it's on the National Register of Historic Places. And it was also included on something called the American Institute of Architects 25-year award list. There's roughly 50 buildings on this list, and they're given to buildings or projects or sites that have retained their design integrity after a quarter of a century. And so people come to this remote part of Maine to study craft, and they also come to visit what many consider as this really pinnacle of American modernism in architecture. This is the ceramic studio. And part of what defines Barnes's project for Haystack is a style of vernacular architecture that is very simple in construction. They're basically, 2x6 framed buildings. They follow this design logic of these kind of two masses, a rectangular mass, then with this triangular mass at the top to let light in, and these sliding barn doors. It's very much a vernacular New England style of construction. There are cedar shake shingles that age with the kind of blow from the ocean, which we sit directly adjacent to. The campus is 50 acres in scale. There's about 36 buildings on it. We run from May through October. And we have truly one of the most remarkably beautiful places that I've ever been to. When Barnes designed the campus, the school's founded in 1950, but moves to Deer Isle in 1960 to this site. And Barnes essentially master planned the whole campus, which means as an architect, he came in when there was nothing here. He designed what this site would look like and what the facility would be. And then it was all laid out and planned. And with very few exceptions, not very much has changed since the time it was built. The core design element of the campus is this iconic staircase that rises from the ocean up a granite ledge and then to the top of the deck. Here you are again at the top. If you kind of look to the left, you'd be seeing the ocean. And everything's connected by these wooden walkways with buildings that kind of touch them and sit off to the sides. If you think about where we are in the country, we are truly kind of in the middle of nowhere in some ways, or I would say we're on the edge of nowhere, but in a really remarkable place. So the arrow shows you where we are, 10 hours from New York City, 5 hours from Boston, 3 hours from Portland, Maine, and that dot literally is where the school is. So the Bay of Fundy extends up into Nova Scotia, the Atlantic Ocean opens out. And then once you make your way up to where we are, and you're moving your way up where you see Rockland, you would keep driving up through Belfast and you go up through Orland at the top, and then you have to drop all the way down again. And then you cross a bridge, and then you cross 2 land bridges, and then you're finally at the school. And Deer Isle is considered the largest island connected by a bridge off the coast of Maine. And we're surrounded by the largest archipelago on the eastern seaboard of these small islands. And so very, very beautiful and remarkable place landscape-wise. And just to the north of us, you can see Mount Desert Island, which is Acadia National Park. And so the coast is undeniable. It's this incredibly rugged landscape comprised of granite ledges that extend in some cases 3 miles deep of granite under the ocean, and then it extends up onto the land. It's a remarkable ecosystem of moss and lichens, some of which are only found in this part of the country. At the height of summer, the moss and the lichen can grow 3 feet thick on stones. And so it takes this landscape that's very hard and rigid and softens it in a remarkable way. And the boundary between land and sea become really kind of permeable. And so this is a photograph taken by a Chicago-based photographer, Jin Lee. Jin was a photographer in residence at Haystack a few summers ago and really captured the kind of ethereal quality of the landscape quite beautifully. And then when you're away from the water just a bit, you're in these very dense spruce forests with these glacial erratics, these large stones that, or boulders that were moved during the last ice age and deposited where they land. And so our lives as kind of human beings is spent navigating this really intense landscape. And of course, a landscape that there were people here long before we arrived. So the land that we occupy is Wabanaki land, and indeed the oldest of settlers that were here long before any of the white folks showed up. This is what the water looks like. This is on my drive to work, actually. I shot this from the window of my car one day I stopped during a really rough storm. And then this was an image that has not been color corrected. And this was looking out at the water on a really calm day in late August. So it's really a beautiful place. It's a very remote place. People often say they'll stop by, and my kind of quip is that you don't stop by, like you have to come here. It's not somewhere you end up. And so when I talked about the school's history, we were recently the subject of an exhibition that told the story of the founding years of Haystack. And this is the exhibition catalog called In the Vanguard, which tracked the school from its founding in 1950 to 1969. And so those first 19 years. This is a very famous image of Haystack on the right, a weaving workshop taught by Jack Leonard Larson, a really renowned textile designer who actually just passed away in December at the age of 94. One of the people that had the longest connection with Haystack over his lifetime. The school was founded by a group of craftspeople in Maine who had the idea of starting an experimental school that would celebrate craft in Maine, and that would really be this experiment, an experiment in community and education and in making. Mary Beeson Bishop was a very wealthy benefactor from Flint, Michigan, and through a series of kind of serendipitous connections, Mary Bishop supported the school financially, and she allowed this experiment to begin. The school originally was in a place called Montville, Maine, which is about an hour and a half from where we are now inland. And there was discussion of starting a school, and within 1 year, the school started. There was no big planning, there was no fundraising initiatives and no planning committees. It was a small group of people. They had a bit of money. They built some very temporary, very rustic structures, and people gathered together. This is one of the original shots from that campus. Again, this is probably 1952. It's an unknown maker in the photograph, but someone working in the ceramic studio. And the school originally could accommodate a total of 26 people, 26, and that was it. And they would work in ceramics, in wood, in weaving, and in graphics. And graphics at the time was added as a counterpoint to craft, and it was believed that the crafts should have to kind of reference themselves to contemporary art. And in the 1950s, contemporary art was the graphic arts, quote unquote, of painting and drawing, printmaking. And the school has always had a very close relationship with Black Mountain College. And if you know your history of kind of the American avant-garde, then you know Black Mountain. If you don't know that history, I would encourage you to learn more about it, because it's perhaps one of the most influential educational experiments in the United States, founded on the principles of John Dewey. It exists in Black Mountain, North Carolina. The school closes in 1957. It had a relatively short lifespan of existence, but it was truly a democratic place of education and learning. Again, it's an institution with no grades, a horizontal approach to the relationship between students and faculty. And it was a place where there was very little structure, and it was a place of open experimentation and creativity. People like Merce Cunningham, John Cage, in this case, Buckminster Fuller, teach there. And Buckminster Fuller ends up designing the first early iterations of his geodesic dome. And here's Bucky in the front, and then the students hanging on the dome to test its tensile strength. People like MC Richards, the incredibly influential potter and poet who then leaves Black Mountain and comes through Haystack. Remember that Black Mountain closes in 1957, Haystack's founded in 1950 and moves to Deer Isle in 1960. Many of the people who are at Black Mountain are emigres who are fleeing Europe. A lot of Jews who are fleeing Nazi Germany come through the US and end up at Black Mountain, including Joseph Albers, who then ends up leaving Black Mountain with his wife, Ani Albers, and then moves to Chicago, and then ultimately onwards from there. So MC Richards, again, potter and poet who ends up finishing her life living in Steiner communities and working in anthroposophy. I'm sorry, give me one moment on the name, which I just had a complete blank on. Paul Berenson, originally trained as a dancer, teaches at Black Mountain, and then comes through and spends quite a bit of time at Haystack, works as a potter, and lives his life in Penland, North Carolina. Ruth Asawa, Japanese-American artist, who, in many ways didn't receive quite that much recognition in her lifetime, and in recent years, there's been a wonderful resurgence of attention on her work and life and practice. Ani Albers, the weaver. Ani Albers would, again, leave Black Mountain and come through and spend time at Haystack. A remarkable, remarkable artist who, again, has now been the subject of pretty remarkable attention for her work in weaving and design. Kei Sekamachi, and this is at the original campus. And so when the school moves to Deer Isle, there's really this moment at which this educational experiment is clearly working. There was a need to have more space, and there was a desire for larger ambitions. And so this site on Deer Isle was discovered. It was purchased for a very low amount of money, even in that day. Mary Beeson Bishop makes this possible. Edward Larrabee Barnes is hired as the architect, and the campus opens in 1961. And we've continued operating without any interruption until 2021, when we suspended programming because of COVID for the summer. So these are images of the school. And what's so special about this place is it's not only the architecture, and it certainly isn't just the equipment in the studios, of which you can have anywhere, but it's the sense of community that happens, and it's the relationship of people to the environment, and the kind of intensity of time that people spend together in a way that's really remarkably life-changing. I think we embody a real spirit of democracy and democratic ideals in kind of a flattening out of hierarchy and how people work together. And again, the time that's spent in these kind of people from all over the world that come together for these intense periods of time. We have these wonderful dinners on the shore every Saturday night with each session. And most people come to the school for 2 weeks at a time in a workshop that focuses on ceramics, glass, wood, metal, fiber, graphics. This is our auditorium where we have presentations every evening. This is an impromptu gathering on the deck where there was a violinist from Vienna who happened to be in the region, and I heard about it and was able in 24 hours to get him to come and play this beautiful piece for everyone. These are the sleeping cabins where everyone stays. And again, you can see how everything's lifted off the forest floor. And all the structures are built on these pylons. And so there's this sense that the entire place is floating and it's kind of hovering above a very delicate landscape. And I think that sense of kind of respect for the land and an attempt to care for this very delicate place that we inhabit, I think really drives much of our thinking about ecology and design. This is an image of the dining hall. The school's quite small. We can accommodate 94 people at a time, and we have no intention of ever getting any larger. And so all the people that come to the school are able to share meals together at the same time and in the same place. And food is indeed a really important part of kind of our time together. And so this is an example of what our catalog looks like. We're not different, or I should say we're similar to other schools like ours. And within craft, that would be places like the Penland School, the Arrowmont School of Arts and Crafts in Tennessee, the Pilchuck Glass School, Peters Valley Craft Center. And so our programs are all structured on this intensive workshop model. People come for 2 weeks, they sign up for one dedicated session, and you work in one studio discipline for the entire 2 weeks. Our studios never close. There's no locks on any of the doors. When you come to the school, there's structure during the day within your workshop, demonstrations in the morning and work time and kind of time with the faculty and your colleagues and students in the afternoon. And then people just work around the clock and on weekends. We also run a 2-week residency program, which serves emerging and established artists who work in craft and outside of craft. You don't need to kind of work in one discipline to attend. And the residency program is fully endowed, meaning we've been gifted the funds to run this program in perpetuity, and everyone who is accepted attends for free. And in our workshops, people are coming at all different points in their life. And they come from the age of, you have to be 18 to attend. We have a lot of people come who are in college or graduate school. We have people coming who are in their kind of middle of their lives. We have people coming as working artists, people who are parents and perhaps studied art in college but never got back to it. We have people who are in other careers and they choose to come because they've always wanted to try something. We serve people who identify as artists, and we serve people who identify as non-artists. And the core of the workshop model of education and learning and teaching is embodied so beautifully in this image, right? This is the way we teach and this is the way we learn. Craft is so inherently passed down kind of through oral traditions, right? You learn to blow glass by watching someone, and you learn the process and technique through your body. And so it very much, craft is at the core of this embodied practice. You can't understand it only theoretically. You have to understand the material through your hands. Now, you can choose to be very good and skilled, or you can choose to use materials in an unskilled way. All of this is valid, and all of this is an approach to craft. And I would say craft has actually, in the way we define it at Haystack, craft is not a definition of skill. Craft is a definition of a language and a definition of materiality and a definition of a history and discourse. How you use it is an entirely other question. And so this is an image of a person that's watching someone blow glass. And so she's observing it with her eyes. She's transferring it onto paper with her hand. And then she'll actually engage with the material through the memory of what she's seen and recorded. Like, I can't think of a more interesting and complicated and deep way of understanding the world than what I just described in that image. And perhaps different than contemporary art, quote unquote, contemporary art or other practices, craft is inherently based in community. So much of what we do, you can't do alone. It takes more than one person. And so here, whether it's loading a kiln, or if you're forging and working in blacksmithing, or you're doing a variety of other processes, you're doing it in community. And at Haystack, nothing is done privately. We have no private studios. There's no walls in any of the studios or buildings. Everything is based on an open plan, and you learn kind of alongside others. This is an overhead shot of our digital fabrication lab. We have this really wonderful fab lab that is part of a global network of labs that runs out of MIT and exists on continents around the globe. And we share the connection through open source platforms, and we also share a commitment to providing public outreach through our facility. This is a vital part of the way that our lab functions. And in the summer, it's kind of a hub for all the other studios. This is a really brilliant artist and architect on the far left, Ronald Real, who teaches at Berkeley and in the Department of Architecture, and is really kind of a leader in thinking about 3D printing for architecture and dwellings. And he spent time at the school. Paula Wilson on the far right, teaching a workshop in plein air painting. And then we also serve as a convener. I would say that we're a presenting organization. We often talk about that with theaters, will define themselves as presenting institutions. We're a presenting institution in that every year we convene conferences or think tanks that bring people together to investigate an idea. So here, a summer conference that we've run. This was presented the year before COVID in partnership with the Center for Craft. We also produce publications and scholarship through a monograph series. So all the content from that conference became the next monograph. The year prior, Sheila Pepe produced the monograph and wrote a beautiful one called Sacred as the Mundane. And then this is the one we just published, which includes a really, really beautiful essay by Fo Wilson, who I hope you all know and love at Columbia. And so, it takes money to run an institution, like especially when you are in the not-for-profit world. Money is a reality. Haystack is an incredibly fortunate institution. We have a sizable endowment of roughly $14 million. It costs about $2.3 million to run the school each year. The endowment helps draw in funds to support really critical initiatives, the majority of which are scholarships. And so we have 91 endowed funds. We provide scholarships to roughly 30% of the people who come here. And each year we award over $350,000 in scholarship support. And we also kind of think every year about like, what can we do to expand the work we do in the audiences we serve? And so this was the most recent project that we developed, which was the first dedicated program for LGBTQ teens in Maine, and where we brought a group of 70 young people to Haystack for a 3-day program taught by nationally recognized artists from around the country. And I have to say, of all the programs I've helped develop, I think this is one of the most remarkable ones I've had the privilege of taking part in. I should say this program is funded. We've raised enough money to run this for the next 3 years. And none of what I just described is done alone. As the executive director, I'm the spokesperson for the school. I am in charge of artistic vision, and I'm in charge of kind of executive oversight and financial and fiscal health. But all of it's done with a board of directors of 27 people, a staff of about 20 people. In a normal world, I would tell you that the application deadline was 2 days ago, but again, we're not living in kind of normal times. And so our programming right now is on hold for the summer. We anticipate we'll be back in operation for public programs in 2022. So that was 2021, right? Like we all know what happens with COVID. And so the question becomes like, what does an organization do when you can't do the things you always do? And I'm not going to spend a long time talking about what we did over the past year, but I will tell you that it was probably one of the most pivotal and transformative years for the organization that we've ever had. When we canceled our programs, we had a donor that provided a gift of $1 million to 5 different craft schools. And we were all able, 5 schools were able to provide stipends to over 500 artists in craft whose workshops had been canceled as a result of the pandemic. We also used our time over the past year to think really deeply about the school, about our commitment to equity, and about how we want to do our work in the most expansive ways. And towards that end, we raised over $50,000 to support scholarships for BIPOC students. Those will all be used now in the summer of 2022 when we reopen. And we raised $50,000 in 4 months to support this initiative. We also realized that there was a need in our immediate community for PPE, for face shields, and for other vital equipment that frontline workers couldn't get in the kind of first 2/3 of the pandemic. And so we suddenly used our Fab Lab to start making PPE. We put out there that we were available to do it. And to date, we've made over 6,000 items out of a very small facility that's run by one staff person and 2 high school interns who were paid for their work. And we've donated every item to over 100 community organizations. We also used our time to work on a comprehensive strategic plan to think about the next 5 years and 10 years of the organization. Strategic planning is a huge part of what not-for-profits can and need and should do to think critically about their history and about their position, about where they want to be. And we thought about, core commitments, and we redrafted our mission statement. We worked on values and 10-year visions, all of which the entire 55-page plan places equity at the core of all of that work. And we define terms for ourselves as an organization, from how do we think about intersectionality and sustainability, inclusion, diversity, and equity, and how do we then use a plan like this as a filter for every decision we make. And so for the second time, Haystack has made the decision to suspend programs for this summer, but different than last season where we focused on organizational development, this season we are launching an ambitious series of online programs, and those are actually going to go public in the next few weeks. And so you'll be hearing about this soon. So the last thing I'll end with for about 3 minutes is to just give you the overview of the fellowship program that Columbia College and the Office of Academic Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion that we've developed together. I love this image so much. This was taken again on that last trip just before the pandemic with Josue Romero and Peyton Harris Woodward. Josue had been a student at Haystack prior and had just started at Columbia, and Peyton was part of our fellowship program and as an intern for the school, where I got to reconnect with them on that trip. So we launched this program in 2017. It's a fellowship and a paid intern in arts administration. It's run out of the Office of Academic Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. It's available for continuing undergraduate and graduate students. And it was designed entirely with Fo Wilson and Mel Potter. And they really were the kind of brilliant people that helped think through how we could structure a program that would build on itself over time, that would support the school, support the students, and most importantly, would support a commitment to increasing opportunities for students of color to come to schools such as ours. Now you could ask, why do we need to do that? And we need to do that because craft schools like Haystack are predominantly, historically, have been white institutions. And so as this changes, we make meaningful change by setting up long-term partnerships. We support 4 students a year. We're entering the 4th year of the partnership, and I've committed as executive director that we will fund this Haystack for up to 10 years. We provide 2-week workshops in a space for students, and it runs in this time period of late July to early August. Students are provided with tuition, room, and board, a $500 travel stipend, and $100 in a material shop fee that's provided by Columbia. And as Mel said in the beginning, it's open to undergrad and graduate alumni students. There's requirements set by the school of a GPA and good academic standing, and also priority given to graduate students and undergraduate juniors and seniors who will be returning for their final semester. We say fall of 2020, but returning again in the fall before the program runs. Of the 4 people who come, Columbia selects 1 person to stay on as an intern in arts administration, and they stay for an additional 3 weeks at the school. So they'll spend a total of 5 weeks with us. As an intern in arts administration, they're paid a $2,000 stipend. Again, they're given private housing while they're here, and they're given complete exposure to the internal workings of a not-for-profit. And I work one-on-one with them for those weeks. They help to run a conference, to help run a gala fundraiser. They see how we administer programs. And they both learn from us, and we also learn from them in really wonderful ways. And so this was our kind of founding cohort over the past 3 years. I really wish that I had 2020 on here and that we would be heading into our next year, but we'll just have to continue it. And so, Mel, I'm going to stop there. This is the end of the presentation.
Fantastic. Paul, it's so interesting. Every time I talk to you, I have thousands more questions, but I just want to thank you for such a generous and broad conversation. And, you know, many things stick out, but some things I think were really unique to your discussion and chapters was over time, you've maintained an ethos in which you thoughtfully ask about what your work, whether it's material or organizational, is contributing to the world. And I think that that's such a poignant and important question during these times. I also just want to point to your discussion about your dedication to professional organizations, because as some of my students who are here know, I've argued recently that I think professional organizations are going to be the lifeline and the democratic space of the art world going forward, now that we've lost so much of what it was, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So I thank you for that. And then also how we're affected by place. And of course, you know, just the extraordinary place that is Haystack. I will attest to the mind-blowing nature of its lichen. But also the way you talked about craft as an embodied practice, and the way that crosstalks with the place of Haystack. And that, you know, that for me was like a little bit of a breakthrough, this idea that an embodied practice is best served in a place that sort of reflects the depth of that embodiment. And so I was fascinated with that. As I mentioned earlier, we have some really lovely questions, and I, in a way, don't even want to start with one in particular because I feel like it's going to be so leading. But I think, you know, based on your conversation, I want to amplify this idea of you as a maker, a thinker, and an administrator. And so one of the questions asked, which you touched on, but I think it'd be nice to go in greater depth. As an artist and executive director of an art school and residency program, what do you think is advantageous about having both of these experiences? And how do they affect both your work as a director? And I know you talk about your work being on hiatus, but we know you'll be back in the studio probably at some point. I mean, how do those things kind of crosstalk to one another?
I don't really know how to have a perspective other than what I have, right? So I can't say, I guess, except what I bring to it. And I think that there's something really powerful about artist-led organizations. And I think it's different from organizations that are led by a kind of a CEO model. There's a lot of organizations that bring in an executive director who's like a business person. They handle the money, and then they bring in an artistic director to run the programming. And for me, I think that model can work potentially, and I guess depending on the scale you're at, it becomes necessary. But there's something really powerful about making sure that every decision we make is filtered through that lens of what it means for artists. And there's no way that I can ever not be asking or thinking about that question, because it's the thing that I care the most about. And so I think that there's that's one thing that I would say. I think that artists are actually have great ability to succeed in these kinds of jobs if you're the right sort of person, because artists are really good at chasing down things they're interested in and figuring it out. Like, I had no experience in fundraising when I took this job. I knew nothing about like budgets. I mean, I literally I didn't have that direct experience. I knew about it a bit. I'm lying a little bit, but I didn't, you know, it wasn't my life. But I was interested in it in the same way that I was interested in how to like make flexible molds, or I was interested in using like a certain material. And so for me, it just became this like really interesting abstract problem that I could just dig into and solve. I also think that as an artist, I see this organization and everything that I'm involved in as an administrator, as an executive director, it's all malleable. Like, everything can be pushed around and retooled. And so there's something about like seeing things from a very big perspective that way that I think artists can be very good at. I think artists also can get lost in the weeds like nobody's business as well. right? Which is also at times a good thing. But so I think it's always this balancing. And so
Well,
maybe that's the best and the worst of it. Yeah.
I mean, I've, listening to you, I think about the ways in which a creative person, an artist, resists compartmentalization. So, you've also kind of described a flow, basically, that, your practice as a director is a creative practice, and that Haystack is very well served by that, especially in times of such profound change. So, what the question of place, one of our students asked, how can you give some great examples maybe of the ways that you've seen the place really affect the art that's being made at Haystack? I mean, the food is, I will attest, I gained 7 pounds while I was there. It was phenomenal. This sort of open space of it, the smell, the experiences, the field trips that you do, the rocks at night, all of it. But could you be precise about how you see some of that being reflected in the work being made there? And if that's too hard, I can be leading with the glass studio, because I feel like, your images
No,
of
it's not too hard, but like, I'm also really suspicious of the whole like narrative about nature that happens at a place like this. I think that there's really this narrative of the transformative power of nature. And for some people that's true. For others, it's not true at all. There's also a history of where we are of like, this wasn't our place. Like, we weren't here originally. So what does that mean? And what does it mean for us to talk about, caring for the land when in fact, like it wasn't ours to begin with, So I think it's like a complicated answer. But what I think specifically happens at Haystack, and I should say, I think it happens immediately. The other things I just mentioned are like, if you're awake and paying attention, you've got to ask those questions too. But what happens is that the landscape here is so powerful, and it's so undeniable, and it's so omnipresent that it's bigger than you in a really interesting way. And so I've heard this about places like UCross, which is the residency that's in Wyoming. I've heard people talk about UCross that way. And I've heard it about a few other places, but I think that like Haystack's one of those places where the landscape is just undeniable, and it's constantly changing, and it's profound. So I think it frames activity in an interesting way.
Well, and I remember in the early days when Fo and I were working on developing the scholarship with you, there were some really thought-provoking questions about what it meant for our students, some of whom had never been out of the state, but what it meant to be sort of off the grid in the way that Haystack provides too. This idea of being, cell phone service not necessarily working as well as we expect it to, and kind of the ways that the shift of time and space is different. So yes, you're in nature, but you're also in this community, this tighter community that is paying its full attention to the process of making and thinking through making, and not to all the other additives. So yes, I think it's also multifactorial in that way too. I mean, that's a nice segue into a question we have about, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you talked about the predominance of the white narrative, or the white, participant in a place like Haystack, and that's been true of craft in general. Fo and I also have really interesting conversations about the BIPOC narrative in craft, and what a great space that is becoming. And I'd love to hear more. I think our students would love to hear more too about what the role of having BIPOC and Alana students, LGBT, thinking more about our diversities in these predominantly white spaces, how that transforms the space, how that transforms the school, but also how that can transform the experience of the students as well.
Yeah. I think for a long time, places like hours, and as an executive director or as a leader, you don't just get to wear the hat of the good things you're doing now moving forward. Like, you have to wear the hat of everything your institution did, good, bad, or indifferent. So institutions like ours, I think for a long time, the discussion was, we need more diversity. We heard this a lot, right? This is like an old discussion now it's outdated too, right? It's like, we need more diversity. And it's like, well, towards what end? Do we need it and not change anything else? Do we need it and just run business as usual and sprinkle in a few extra people? Or what is that even about? And as much as I could say that craft has historically been a dominantly white field, that's only craft within a certain context. Craft more broadly, that's like been led and championed and shaped by so many voices. And so institutions like this have been historically slow to acknowledge it. Now, that said, from its earliest days, Haystack was championing women. It was a school founded primarily by women. It was a school that in some of our earliest board minutes, there is discussion about making sure we supported people who were Jewish at a time when Jews were being excluded from so much in the 1950s, right? So I think Haystack, it welcomed immigrants at times when people were pushed out. So I think that as an experimental kind of community, that's always been the case. But I think the 1980s didn't do us a great service, right? Like, I think it was a moment at which the brakes hit. And I could talk about that for a long time in a whole nother way. But what it does now, it basically reflects the extraordinary ways that people are making and thinking broadly. And it's just, this is what you do. This is what you do. This isn't like, we shouldn't get like an award for doing it. This is just like, you want to be a valid, relevant organization, then you do it. One of the questions that was in the chat had to do with, was there always a sense of openness like this? Over the process of a democratic and trusting organization always been there, or has it evolved? And I would say it's both always been there and it's evolved at the same time, right? Like, we are gatekeepers. It's a term that not everyone likes, but it's true. Like, we have been a gatekeeper to a certain history of craft. And so, what does it mean if you want to change that, that becomes the organization's work. And as far as I'm concerned, it needs to be like our top priority.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we have actually one of our professors who dropped a really interesting question, which I think is a perfect follow-up. Would you agree that what we study as art from many cultures in our art history courses, particularly from cultures around the globe, are in fact examples of craft? Would you comment on this?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. There's craft, and then there's what I sarcastically refer to as craft with a capital C, right? Craft with a capital C is what the American craft movement, which is like a thing, you can study it, it's written about. That's like a certain history. It's been delineated and defined. But that question, absolutely, this is like a wonderfully rich, deep practice that's been going on and is going on and will continue to go on. It's a question of like, have we paid attention to it?
So, a student also asked about the pandemic. You and I talked a little bit before the conversation about, the pandemic and making and virtual. And so, this conversation about how to invent the organization online. Can you talk a little bit about how that's been and what you've been selecting too for what you would produce online?
Yeah, when COVID began, there was a flurry among not-for-profits to shift things online. Now, academic institutions, I suppose, had to do it because students are paying for a product of a degree and they need to get it. Like, you don't just decide to stop. And so lots of people said, well, we should transition everything online. And I was adamant that we shouldn't. And I said, that makes no sense. It completely undercuts the specialness of what happens here. And the only benefit to doing it would be to make money. And we didn't have to do that. We had ways of surviving without doing that. And so if we didn't do it, it would give us time to do what small not-for-profits never can do, which is focus on organizational development, as it's called. We could work on looking at fundraising in new ways. We could look at building audiences in ways that we desire to do. We could work on a strategic plan. We could do all that work because we weren't trying to create content online. And lo and behold, no one went anywhere. They were all still there for us. We actually had the biggest fundraising year in our history.
Wow.
So that's interesting to me. We decided this year it was important to transition content online, but we decided, and I'm giving you the unofficial preview that no one's heard, which is that we're not putting workshops online in that way. Instead, we've thought about presenting content through program threads like craft history and theory, about mentorship and critique, about artist lectures and panels, about conversations between people and ideas. But I think if you want to like learn to make something, there's a lot of great YouTube videos you can learn to do that are probably way better produced than we're going to do. But if we think of ourselves as a producing organization or presenting organization or as a convener, this gives us a remarkable way to convene thinkers and to make that available broadly and use that as a way to help us further define how we want to expand our work, to provide greater access to the school, given how remote we are. So aspects of what we're about to unroll in a few weeks are actually not going to go away. We're actually probably going to, we've been trying to build models that will carry us forward, not be a Band-Aid. And we're also experimenting with what it means to offer that for almost no charge. Like how do we leverage our endowment to support that? Right? Like what's our role as an institution with funding? How can we do that?
That's really interesting.
Asking.
That's incredibly interesting. And, you know, I'll close. We have just a couple more minutes left, but you know, there's this very interesting tension in craft around the past and the present and the future. You know, this idea of things that were done as they were in long ago, and this future to which we're trying to point. And I think it takes a lot of discipline to treat the internet. We were talking about this. It takes a lot of discipline to treat the internet for what it can do and not to manufacture something that shouldn't necessarily be. So I'm really excited to hear about what you're unrolling there. So, you know, as you move forward, do you think that you'll be continuing this sort of online world in parallel with trying to reopen the school next year, or what are your thoughts there?
I think, well, my instinct is, you know, Haystack has a footprint that's active and operating with people 6 or 7 months out of the year. And I think that we have the opportunity to perhaps connect with people online in those other months when we're not running in person. You know, we're a small institution with a small staff. And so part of my job as a leader is, you know, I have to think about developing programming and expansion in ways that are sustainable models and not models that are going to be built on the backs of my staff. And so there's only so much we can do. We can't do everything. We can't be everything. And so I think it's very important that we try to build this very intentionally and very carefully. And if we do it right, I think it potentially is going to have the ability to really transform the school. And we are in a position and asking questions now that we never would have asked had the pandemic not happened. And so I do not wish that this had happened, but I think that we have harnessed the opportunities and the challenges through a remarkable group of people thinking through it with us in a way that I think will look back on as a kind of a watershed moment.
It's amazing, Paul. What a great way to end. And I'm just excited to see the future of how things evolve at Haystack and with your work, your really visionary work. Thank you so much. I want to invite everyone to the March 17th discussion with Natani Nota. Again, Paul, thank you so much for such an insightful and thought-provoking talk. And I'm looking forward to next week when we record our conversation with Namita Gupta-Wiggers and Bob Blandford.